Hi everyone, in this tutorial we're going to be going over highlights and shadows. Alright, let's get started. So one thing you want to consider when you're adding highlights and shadows to your objects is what is the surface of your object made out of? Is it smooth? Is it rough? Because that's going to affect how the light hits it and affects it. You're going to want to consider where your light source is coming from. So this is where the light's hitting it. This will be the lighter side and you have a bit of a highlight here. And then you're going to get a form shadow on your object here, the side that isn't in light. We're not going to cover cast shadows until the next tutorial. I'll show you how to do those. Right now we're just going to focus on the highlight we're creating and then the shadow on the object. Okay, so right now we have just a flat pool ball here, flat colors, no light hitting it, so it looks really two-dimensional. So what we could do is add a highlight and a shadow to the ball to give it a little bit more form and some volume, give it a three-dimensional feel. So for instance, for this one down here, we have a highlight here, our light is hitting it here, so the shadow would be down on this side. And this one here, we have more of a softer highlight, the light's coming from the side and giving us a shadow here. So these pool balls here feel like more of a sphere, they have more shape to them than this flat little circle here. And it's really not that hard to add highlights and shadows, and it just adds so much more to your project. Okay, so let's go over some of the ways to create our highlights and shadows. I'm just going to copy this ball here. So if we want to make a highlight like this one here, I just used a basic ellipse. So just go over to your shape, select your ellipse tool, and then create your ellipse. It's already white, that's good. I'm going to move it over and just drop it on somewhere where I want it. So that highlight right now looks too tight and too bright. We want it something more like this. For that, we can add a blur to it and adjust the opacity. So first thing I'm going to do is open up my Appearance panel. So you want to go to Window and Appearance, or use Shift F6. So if we select our object, we could adjust the properties through here. So we want to adjust the opacity, which is the transparency of it. So if you just click on that, you'll see this 100% by the opacity. So right now it's 100% opaque. It's not transparent at all. If you click on that, you can drag it and it'll be more see-through. That looks good, but it's still a little too tight around the edges. We want to blur it a little bit. So with that, we're going to use a Gaussian blur. So we want to click on it. We want to come up to Effect. We haven't used Effects yet, so we'll go down to Blur and select the Gaussian blur. So that's going to bring up this box here. If you hit Preview, you'll be able to see the blur as you adjust it. So we can see it right there. If we go all the way to the end, it blurs so much that we can't even see it anymore. See, it's so blurred. So that you could use for something that has a rougher surface where you won't see such a tight highlight. And if we bring it down, the surface starts to look smoother and shinier. So let's go with something like that. Okay, so there's our highlight. Now we want to make this shadow here, which is really easy to do using our Pathfinder tool. We covered the Pathfinder tool in a previous tutorial, so go back to that one for a refresher. So what we want to do first is open up our Pathfinder palette. So go to Window and hit Pathfinder. Alright, so I'm just going to copy and paste our original circle here. But I had this as a group originally when I copied it, so this one is still a group. So I want to click on it and hit Ungroup, and that'll let me just select the one circle here. I'll undo that. Okay, I'm going to copy, Control-C, and Control-V to paste. Now I have my circle, and I'm going to just paste one more. So to get this shape, right here, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and build the shape here. So I'm looking at this segment here. That's the piece I'm going to use for my shadow. So maybe something about that size. If you select both of them and come up to the minus front one, it's going to minus the circle in front and just leave us with this piece. Okay, so now I want to use this sliver here as my shadow. I'm just going to move it into position, and I can nudge it with my arrow keys. And then we just want to change the color on that. So I'm going to click on it, and we'll do maybe just a darker red. Okay, so again, that is too tight of a shadow, and we want to blur it a little bit. So I'm going to click on it, come up to Effect, Blur, and do a Gaussian blur. And again, you want to hit Preview, and so that's going to show it. So it blurs kind of off the side, but you can move it in after you adjust it. So I think where I had it was nice. We'll hit OK on that. Now if you want to adjust the blur more, it shows up in here as well in the Appearance panel. So you can just click on that and adjust it from there. And right now it's not selected, so we want to select it first, and then we'll be able to do it. And you have to hit preview again if you want to see your changes. And then just adjust it to where you want it. Okay, so something like that is nice. Blur's a little too far off the edge, so I'm just going to slide that in a bit. And you can also shrink it just to make it fit, whatever looks nice. Okay, so there we're getting a nice highlight spot from our light source, and then that's causing the shadow here, and that gives it a nice three-dimensional feel. For the highlight and shadow on this one, I also use the Pathfinder tool. I'll just copy this again, move it down, and I'm going to ungroup it. Okay, so again, I'll be using this one here to create these two shapes. So I'm going to copy it and paste it. I'm just going to move it out of the way to work on it. Now I'm going to want to copy and paste it again, and just slide it over. If I select both of them, I'm going to use this sliver here for a highlight and this sliver here as a shadow. So I'm going to select both of them, and I'm going to use the divide in my Pathfinder. Hit divide, and if you remember from the Pathfinder tutorial, what the divide does is divides it, but it creates a group. So you're going to want to ungroup that, and now you can select the pieces individually. So we don't need this middle piece. I'll delete that, and we're left with these two pieces here. This is what we're going to use. So I'm just going to grab one for now, and I'll just slide it over, and I'm going to shrink it down a little bit and just move it into a place I like. Maybe something like that. Okay, so we'll use this as our shadow. I'll just darken it up a bit. Maybe move it back a bit. And we'll use this one as our highlight. And let's make that a white. Okay, so we can lower the opacity on this one. You don't want to lower this one under the stroke. You want to lower the opacity under the fill. So we'll just hide that one for now. So we'll click on opacity and just drop that down a bit. Maybe something like that. Okay, I think we're going to want to blur that too, just to get that look. So I'm going to click on it, go to Effect, Blur, and add the blur. I'll hit Preview, and something like that looks nice. Hit OK, and I think I'm going to shrink this one down a bit, just to get a nice little highlight edge there. And move that over to the edge. Okay, so that gives us a nice highlight there. Looks like our light source is coming from the side, and we're just going to blur this one too. Preview that. Something like that looks good, and hit OK. And now that I see it without it being selected, I think it needs a little more of a blur. So to do that, we just click on it. Our blur's already on here in our appearance panel. We can just click on that, add a little more. We'll hit Preview. Yeah, maybe something like that. Alright, and that just gives us the shadow on that one. Alright, and that gives you an idea of how you can be making your shadows and highlights. Alright, now I'm just going to show you on my project here quickly how I would use highlights and shadows to give my pumpkin some more form and shape here. So right now I have just flat coloring on it, but I think it would look cool if each segment of the pumpkin had its own highlight and its own shadow, just to make it pop out from the other pieces. So to do that, I can just select my piece that I want, and I'm going to copy it, paste it, and I'll use this just as we did with the pool balls to make my highlights and shadows. I'm just going to paste a second one, and then I'll use this to clip out a piece for my shadow. So I think I want to use this as my shadow, and actually I can use the end here as my highlight. So what I'm going to do is select them both, and I'll use the divide option in my Pathfinder tool. And again, it's going to put it into a group, so I'll just ungroup that, and I don't need this middle piece, so I'll delete that out. And then I have these two pieces here, and I want to put them on here. So I'm going to lay it over here. That's where I'll put it. And so it's going over top the eyes. I want it to be just over top of this segment here. So that, if I click on it, I can see it's this piece here. Piece 1 is highlighted. So I'm going to grab these two paths that I just made, these ones here, and just drop them over top of piece 1. So now that goes behind the eye. So what I want to do is just darken that, give it a little bit of darker color for a shadow. Maybe something like that. I can just nudge it over with my arrows to where I want it. And then I'll use this piece as my highlight. So I'll move that in, and I will change the color of that So I won't go white on this one. I'm just going to go a lighter orange. This isn't such a shiny object, so it won't have a really tight highlight. Okay, I think I'll blur these. So I'll come up to Effect, Blur, hit my preview. And that's not a bad blur. Maybe a little less. Something like that. Hit OK. So there's my highlight. And if I want, I can shrink that a bit. It's kind of coming off the side. And I'll also blur my shadow here. Okay, so this could maybe be a little lighter. I'm just going to drop the opacity of it. Go to my Appearance panel, click on Opacity. Maybe something like that. Okay, so I'm not a big fan of this piece here, so I'm going to just use my Direct Selection tool. I'm going to zoom in, I'll select it. I can see I have an anchor in here that I won't need. So I'm going to grab my Pen tool, I'll use my Delete Anchor Point tool, and I'm going to hover over this one. I'll delete that one out, and I'll also delete that one out. Okay, now I'm just going to use my Direct Selection tool, click on the anchor point that I want, and then just slide it over to where I want it. And then you can adjust these two, just get it into a place you want. Alright, I think something like that works. So you can see that starts to give it a lot more shape and just gives it a 3D effect instead of looking so flat. I went ahead and did a few more of the segments here, just so you can get an idea of what it'll look like. So I think that looks a lot better than just the flat pumpkin I had before. I wanted to add that you don't have to use the Pathfinder tool and cut from your existing shapes. I just find that easier. You could go and just use your pen tool and just draw out the highlights you want. So if I want to highlight here, I can just come in and just draw the shape that I'm going to want. So if I want this to be my highlight, it's going to be very rough, but again, you would smooth it out. So you can make that shape, and then you can adjust the color on it and create your highlights that way. I just find it easier to use an existing shape, but if you want to do it this way to create your highlights, you can do that too. Alright, that's going to cover it for this tutorial on highlights and shadows.